With this lecture, we're starting at the beginning. And I don't mean that we're starting with looking at some of the earliest artworks made by man. There's actually another task at hand before we can even begin to entertain that process. And that is learning visual literacy. Now, what I mean by visual literacy, you might know the word literacy refers to reading. Visual literacy is learning how to read images. In order for you to be able to study art history, you need to have a sense of what to look for. Essentially, what are the details that make up a work of art, and how can you use these details as a way to craft an interpretation? That's what we're going to be looking at in this lecture. And this lecture is actually one of two parts. We start with the formal elements. These are the details. These are the building blocks of art. Small details that you might overlook or might not seem important, but actually, once you know what to look for, you'll realize contain a lot of meaning and are very rich in their potential for interpretation. These are things like line or shape or color. So these building blocks, this is going to be the topic of our first of our two-part series. And then the second part, we're going to look at design principles, which are how these formal elements are arranged. And in turn, what meaning can we deduce from these decisions regarding arrangement? Now, with formal elements, we're going to cover a few in this lecture. This is by no means an exhaustive survey. There are a lot of formal elements. I'm going to introduce some to you here. You'll be introduced to some more examples in your reading. And in your reading, you'll be encouraged to, on your own, investigate even more formal elements. So formal elements galore. Now, with formal elements, there's two things that are very important to consider. And this is what will help you use these details when you interpret a work of art. So the first thing is the appearance. What does that formal element look like? So that's the first thing we want to consider. The second thing, and this is, I would argue, the most important part of the formal element, is the psychological impact. With these formal elements, they don't just have a visual appearance, but that visual appearance has the potential to affect the viewer, to make the viewer feel a certain way, or to make certain associations. Now, this is important because it helps to explain artists' motivations. Art is not random. You're going to hear me say quite a bit in this class, there's no such thing as a coincidence. When artists make works of art, it's part of a very strategic decision-making process. This idea of choosing very specific features that will communicate a specific message. And think about it. Why do people make art? You know, a main argument that many people like to throw out there is that art is intended to communicate. So if you're trying to communicate something, you want to make sure that what you're saying is articulated as clearly as possible so that your message is something that the viewer understands. So those are the two things that we'll be concentrating on. And just as we move through this lecture, keep your ear out for these two different components. All right, let's get started. So we're going to start with line. And you might be thinking, well, a line is just a line. Actually, a line is not just a line. There is a lot that can be said about lines, believe it or not. Now, in art, there's many different types of lines, and we're not going to go over all of them. We just don't have the time. I'm going to cover 3 types of lines in this lecture. So the first type of line that we can talk about is analytical lines. Now, analytical lines, in terms of what they look like, they are sharp, straight lines. Now, in terms of why an artist might choose to work with analytical lines, think about this visual description I just provided. They're sharp, they're straight. These lines are very serious, they're very rigid in the way that they've been applied. So oftentimes these lines are used when an artwork wants to convey a sense of seriousness, or if they want to, the artist perhaps wants to create a work of art where there's not a lot of emotional expression going on. And for actually Sol LeWitt, the artist who we see here, this is exactly why he chose to use analytical lines in this manner. So this artwork is about analysis. It's about looking at the artwork and analyzing the relationship between the lines. It's about looking at the different shapes that the lines make. And it's also about the space within which these lines occupy. Now, the whole point is analysis. So if we're thinking about analysis, that is a process that is objective. It's very serious. There's not room for emotion in this, right? So he chooses a line that tends to move away from emotion, that moves away from imagination, so that we're really focused on analysis. In fact, Sol LeWitt was so concerned about his work expressing something that he didn't even touch the artwork, because that could accidentally express something. When an artist creates a work of art, oftentimes their gesture, the movement of their hand when they drew a line or painted a brushstroke, can get recorded onto the surface. And that's seen as very expressive. And so Sol LeWitt did not want to take that risk. The artwork is actually a set of instructions. And he gives that set of instructions to the gallery, and they're the ones that put the lines onto the wall. Now we have another type of line, which we can see on the right, and this is an example of expressive line. Now with expressive line, what we're seeing lines that move every which way. There are some lovely expressive lines in this drawing. Here, we've got some here, these kind of like intense scribbly marks. So good. And the point of an expressive line, and I don't think anyone's going to fall off of their chair when they hear this, is to express. Now, that's pretty vague, and I can't really get that much more in depth because I would say that no two expressive lines are the same. They express different qualities. Here, with this, this kind of scribbly, intense effect, it conveys the intensity of this figure. This is a self-portrait. And you even get that intensity from like this really intense stare that's looking straight at us, the hand on the forehead. The line really complements the personality that's being conveyed here. We can get an idea of who this person is on an emotional standpoint. We can use our imaginations to try to guess as to who this person is as a person. And you can see how these lines really engage our mind in a way that's very different from an analytical line. Now I have a couple examples more just to show you some examples of expressive and analytical lines. So here's some expressive lines in here. They're really tight, they're really dense, but you can see that there are lines that move every which way. Now this here is a gospel book. It's a religious text. And so we can say things like these expressive lines convey a sense of energy. And perhaps that energy is meant to underscore, the energy of God, his ability to create, his ability to give life. Now over here, there are a lot of analytical lines. And again, we know that this conveys a sense of seriousness. This piece is called the expulsion, right? This person's being kicked out. Being kicked out of something is not fun and games. That is a serious affair. And you can see by this person's stern expression, and this always makes me feel kind of sad, where he looks very rejected. He's got his cute little lamb right here, not coming in the temple. So Giotto, who is like a complete and total boss when it comes to pre-Renaissance painting, I just have to throw that in there. He does a really good job of imparting the seriousness and the severity of this situation by choosing to work with analytical lines. Now there's a third type of line, and this is called implied line. Now with implied lines, these are lines that are not drawn or painted in. These are lines that are implied or suggested. And the red lines that you see here, they're lines that I've drawn in, just so you can see where the implied lines are located. This is not originally part of the work of art. Now with implied lines, there's a couple things that can create them. One is an eye line, spelled E-Y-E, eye line. An eye line refers to the direction of a glance. This is based off of human psychology. Humans, we are fundamentally nosy creatures. If somebody is looking at something, we want to know what they're looking at, so we'll follow the direction of that glance. Another thing that creates an implied line is pointing. Same idea. If someone's pointing at something, we want to know what they're pointing at, and we're going to follow that. Even like a gesture of the arm, putting the arm out, that's also something that can lead the eye. So let's look how this operates in this copy of a Da Vinci painting. So when Da Vinci created this work, he made the educated guess that you're going to start looking at the painting right here. And he made this guess for two reasons, and it's a good guess. First of all, when people look at a work of art, they usually, there are exceptions, but they usually will start in the middle. So he's assuming you're going to start there because it's in the middle. Now, the other reason why he thinks you're going to start here, I'm not going to tell you yet. I'm going to keep you in suspense, but we'll come back and I'll show you what I'm talking about when the timing is right. So he thinks that you're going to start here. Now, what happens next? Not as clear. Maybe you were somebody who was curious about what this lady's looking at. So you're going to follow the eye line down this way. You're going to notice this cute little guy right here, eye line gesturing this way. And then your eye is led up through this arm back to the face. Now, perhaps though, you are more interested in the arm extending out. Arm extends down here, and then you'll notice the pointing finger, the eye line. Here's another gesture that leads you this way, and here's the arm that brings us up. No matter which way you started, what's going to happen is through the use of implied line, your eye is going to go like this, and you'll just circulate around the interaction of these figures. And this is the point of the implied line, to guide your eye. There's a lot going on in a work of art, and an artist wants to make sure that you are focusing in on the things that are most important for communicating the message. What's most important in this painting is this interaction here. The artist does not want you wandering off here in the background. It doesn't matter. They're rocks. They're just there to kind of frame the scene. This is what's most important, and the implied lines will keep you focusing on that area. Now, here's another example of implied line. This is a sculptural work, and you can see, now that you're an expert on implied lines, how these implied lines are operating. First, take a look at the implied lines, the eye lines. And I'm not going to point them out yet because I want you to identify them on your own. And then look at any implied lines that are being created by gestures or pointing. I think this is pretty interesting what's happening here with implied line. Okay, You can see there's an implied line here that leads to here, and then an implied line that leads from here, my mouse went away, here to here, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Here you have an implied line that leads like this, and an implied line that leads like this, back and forth, back and forth. So really what we're doing as the viewer is we're encouraged to go back and forth, back and forth. This poor guy in the background, he's random. He's there, but he's really not the most important part of this artwork. What really is the most important is this interaction that's happening between this man and this woman. So the question then is why? This is, part of what is the meaning, the impact of this choice. Why show this particular interaction? So what this is this is a stele, and a stele it's like an upright slab of stone that was placed in public areas for commemoration. And you don't necessarily have to note this now because we're going to revisit this term when we get to ancient Mesopotamia. But I'm telling you this term now because it does relate to what we're looking at here. These stone slabs that are placed out for commemoration. An example of this is a gravestone. And this is what we're seeing here is a gravestone. So on a lot of these Greek gravestones, they focused on family. And so what we're seeing here looks like some kind of betrothal or perhaps a wedding. I'm going to go more on the betrothal angle because I think there would be different symbolism that we would see if this was a wedding scene. The idea, though, is by having these implied lines where we go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, it really cements the relationship between these people and it cements their sense of connection. And very appropriate when we're looking at this grave marker that's trying to reinforce the family bonds of the people who are laid to rest below this stele. All right, we're going to move on to shape. And the good news about shape is it's pretty straightforward because shapes are made of lines. So a lot of what I just said in regards to line is applicable here. We've got two types of shapes that we're going to look at. We've got geometric shapes. And our example of our geometric shape, you can probably guess, is our Mondrian example on the left. Geometric shapes are shapes that have sharp, straight sides. So what line would make up a geometric shape? If you guessed an analytical line, you would be correct. So we're looking at shapes like squares and rectangles and triangles and that sort of thing. And the psychological effect of a geometric shape is very similar to that of the analytical line. Very severe, very strict. You can see here in this Mondrian painting, it's this grid. There's not a lot of like spontaneity. There's not a lot of, emotional expression happening here. It's very ordered. It's very just so. Now, our other type of shape is a biomorphic shape, also known as an organic shape. You can use these terms interchangeably. They mean the same thing. And we see examples of these shapes with a personal favorite of mine, Yves Tanguy. He was a surrealist painter. And he uses biomorphic shapes to create what he called were mindscapes. And you can see that with these biomorphic shapes, which we would just describe as irregularly shaped shapes, that's why we call them biomorphic or organic, because they seem to parallel the kind of weird, irregular shapes of amoeba and other organisms from our biological world. So he uses these biomorphic shapes because he's attempting to activate your imagination. He wants you to look at these shapes shapes and try to make out what you think these shapes could reference or represent. And the idea is that in the process, you learn some things about yourself, your imagination, your subconscious, your inner psyche. It's like this deep interrogation into who you are as a person. And so again, we've got the ability of these shapes to really work with the mind in these very creative ways, in ways that are not as rigid as something that we see with Mondrian's work. Let's look at a couple other examples. See if you can see which one is the organic or biomorphic shape, which one is the geometric shape. And think about how these artworks make you feel when you look at them. There's Donald Judd, where it's very strict, it's very rigid. And then in contrast, our effigy figure is very fluid with all of these natural forms. The idea behind the effigy figure is to speak to nature, to speak to spirituality and humanity. And you could see how those concepts are loose and they're fluid and they're dynamic. It would make sense to use a biomorphic shape. Donald Judd's work is about objecthood. What does that even mean? Well, it means that it's about the object itself. You are analyzing the squareness of the square. So again, we've got that analysis angle in there. No, room for imagination, no room for motion, anything that's subjective. Analysis is an objective process. And so these lines and these shapes are really meant to encourage that. Now, let's talk about mass. Now, we're going to be focusing on actual mass in this class. And actual mass is connected to artworks that are three-dimensional. Now, when I'm talking about three-dimensional artworks, I'm talking about artworks that occupy our real three-dimensional space. So we're talking about sculpture, we're talking about architecture. Now this is opposed to two-dimensional artworks, which are flat. Those would be things like paintings, drawings, photographs, prints. Now in this class, we're going to overwhelmingly concentrate on three-dimensional artwork. And this is not because they didn't make paintings or drawings in the ancient world. The problem is the paintings and drawings were using very fragile material that does not tend to survive archaeologically. So it's not that they didn't make it, it's just we don't have it, surviving over all of these years. Whereas with sculpture or architecture, you're looking at objects made of stone or metal. And those do tend to stand the test of time. So actual mass has to do with three-dimensional artworks because you have actual physical material that is occupying our actual physical space. Now, just an FYI, if we were going to talk about mass with two-dimensional artworks, we would say that they exhibit implied mass, that they don't actually have mass, but they are representing it. They are implying it. So, like, for example, let's see if I could show something going back. What's a good one? Here's one. So this is an example of implied mass. This is a two-dimensional work of art. It's a painting. It's flat. But you can see that through techniques like shading, for example, Da Vinci has been able to suggest that there's mass. These look like fully rounded three-dimensional forms, even though they occupy a flat surface. So that's an example of implied mass. So actual mass, three-dimensional objects. Now this is very vague, just saying, okay, this sculpture is made of actual material that has a weight and a heaviness to it. So if you're going to work with actual mass, you need to clarify a bit further and talk about what type of actual mass your artwork is utilizing. Now, there's two types of mass, and what's really great is that these are descriptive names. So you can kind of like get the sense of where I'm going just by looking at the name. So, like, for example, closed form mass, which is our example that we have over here. Closed form mass is mass that's closed in on itself. And what that means is that there's no openings. There's nothing in the work of art that sticks out or kind of like goes and ejects out into space. It's all closed in on itself. Now, this is as opposed to open form mass, which we see an example here, where you can see openings in the artwork. Another thing which we don't see here, but can be an indication of open form mass, would be maybe like an arm or something coming out into space. So openings in the artwork and or parts of the artwork that extend out, open form mass. Now let's talk about the psychological components of these two formal elements. I chose to compare these two not only because I think they're really obvious examples of open and closed form mass, but they also are two different works of art that address the same historical event, which was World War II. Now, over here, we have a Holocaust memorial. And the point of a memorial is to remember something. But the idea is we're not just remembering it for like 5 minutes. We are going to remember forever. And so think about the appearance of this. With closed form mass, what we see is we see mass that is heavy and it's dense and it conveys a sense of permanence, a sense of strength. This work of art does not look like it's going anywhere anytime soon. And so the idea that the permanence and the sturdiness this conveys communicates that we will never forget the people victimized by the Holocaust. Now, Giacometti actually lived through the Second World War, and he witnessed a lot of its atrocities. The Second World War was the most violent conflict that anyone had seen yet in the history of humanity. And that's saying something, because we had World War I, which was really violent, and we had, for example, the American Civil War, and that was really violent. But this was like next level. The amount of destruction was unparalleled. And I'm not just talking about human destruction, all the people whose lives were lost, all the people who lived but had physical or psychological trauma from participating in the war. I'm also talking about the toll that was taken on the natural landscape, cities where portions were decimated, damage to the natural landscape. This war, there was an atomic bomb that dropped. So this was something that was very, very difficult and traumatizing for someone to witness. And for Giacometti, he turned to a vein of philosophy known as existentialism. And this is like a super summary, but it's an idea that humanity is weak. There is no God, because how could a God allow for such things to happen? Life is meaningless. Tradition is useless. You know, why have tradition when just life interrupts or ruins everything? It's a very pessimistic way of looking at things. And when you look at this, you can kind of see this sculpture, Giacometti's existentialist predilections. This is a very different work than Whiteread's Holocaust Memorial, which appears very strong, very sturdy. Do you get the sense that this man is very strong or sturdy? I would say not so much. This man has that weakness, that, that weakness of humanity that is promoted by existentialism. He's wasting away. He's, very frail. And I want to point out that part of what really creates that sense of frailty is how thin this figure is. So thin that he's engulfed by all of the space around him. Space is a formal element, not one that I am addressing in this lecture, but one that will appear in your reading, and it's an important one. And I mentioned this in the reading, but I'm going to mention it here. Space is really, really important for sculpture. And it's not just the space that the object itself occupies, but you want to think about the space surrounding the sculpture as well, especially, in this sculpture that we see over here, where it really, really emphasizes how weak and feeble this person appears to be. All right, now we will move on to color. Now, there's a lot that can be said about color. And in fact, you could take a whole class where the whole semester, all you're talking about is color. We're not going to go that in depth because we're not going to talk too much about color. Now, this is because, as I told you earlier, we're not going to look at many paintings or other two-dimensional works that have color. And in terms of three-dimensional work, believe it or not, 9 out of 10 works of architecture and sculpture in the ancient world were originally painted. But because they use such fragile pigments, those pigments haven't stood the test of time, and then to us they appear, blank, that they never had color applied to them. So we don't come across a lot of color, but we come across enough color that I think it's at least important to learn about color interactions as they relate to warm and cool colors. Now, what you see to the right is a color wheel. And essentially what it is color arranged in a circle. And this is very helpful for us because it helps us to understand color relationships, how colors flow and transition from one into the next. Now, warm colors, these are red, orange, and yellow, which we can see over here in the color wheel. Red, orange, and yellow, warm colors. And we call them warm colors because these type of colors are found in things that we associate with warmth. Things like fire and things like the sun. Now, in terms of what is happening visually, with warm colors, they tend to jump out at the viewer. They capture the viewer's attention. And if you look over here at this gorgeous mosaic that dates to early Christian Rome, you get that sense. This figure here, this is Jesus, the historical figure of Christianity. He jumps out at the viewer, and he does so because you can see that he's composed primarily of warmer colored tones. Now, cool colors, purple, blue, green. These colors are typically found in things we associate with coolness, like water or trees or the sky. With cool colors, they recede back into space. And you can see that here, where this gives a sense of space, it gives a sense of implied depth. Now, if I can go back, as promised, I know you've been waiting on the edge of your seat, we return to our Madonna of the Rocks. We talked about this educated guess that the viewer is going to start right in here because the head is placed in the center. The other reason why Da Vinci is guessing this is going to happen, that you're going to start here in the middle, is because you see that this face is made primarily of warm colors that jump out at the viewer. We can see that there's some cool colors directly adjacent. What happens here is this creates what's called a warm-cool color contrast. Putting opposites next to each other, like warm versus cool, it's really vivid in the eyes, and that helps to capture our attention. So there's two things happening here in terms of color that are helping to ensure that when you look at this painting, you start right here. Color. All right, and we've got one more formal element, and that is implied depth. Now, implied depth, it can work with two-dimensional works of art, and it also can work with a type of sculpture known as relief sculpture, which is flat, and then the images extend out from the front. And that's actually what we're looking at here. This is a relief sculpture. So not a two-dimensional work of art technically. Now, with implied depth, the idea is that the artist is trying to imply a sense of depth, of space. And the good news is for us is that in the ancient world, this is a very simple thing. They have two main strategies they use. It's very simple. Now, there is a beautiful exception to this moment in second style Roman mural painting, where they did create very complex representations of space that actually are pretty mind-blowing in how sophisticated they are. But tragedy upon tragedy, we don't have time to talk about Roman painting. So that's not something that I'm going to cover in this class. We will see more complicated representations of space aside from our Roman painting, but that comes a lot later during the Renaissance, which is not this class. So, kind of went off on a tangent there. Let's get back to implied depth. So, one thing that we see is vertical placement. So with vertical placement, what this means is that the higher up something is vertically, the farther back in space that object appears. So this right here, this person, who we'll talk more about who this person is in a minute, this person is shown vertically up higher, and this makes him appear as though he's farther back in space. Now, there's something else I want to say about vertical placement. So vertical placement, it definitely can suggest that someone is farther back in space. But another thing it can do is it can also suggest power, because that person is higher up, there are people below. And that is something that is certainly also happening in this image. So this is a depiction of a Neo-Assyrian king. So this is coming out of Mesopotamia. And he's a king, so obviously super powerful. Here's his queen. Look at the vertical relationships. He's the highest, she's the second highest. They're servants, obviously. They're like fanning him, bringing him food, playing an instrument for him. They're even lower down. So here vertical placement, not only to show that he's farther back in space, but to also give a sense of power as well. The other technique for implying depth is overlap. And we can see some of that here. We can see some of it here. Overlap is where you have one person or an object that's completely unobstructed. You can see that person in their entirety. And they're partially blocking, like you can see right here, somebody else. So because we see this person in their entirety, but this person's partially blocked, it makes it look like this person is closer to us, this person's farther back in space. They both overlap this tree, so that makes the tree look like it's even back farther in space. So you can see these simple techniques actually work pretty well. You've got a singular picture plane, but yet you can suggest multiple receiving planes of space simply by overlapping something or placing it higher up in the composition. So this concludes our lecture on formal elements. We will continue to revisit this material in our next lecture, which is Principles of Design.